There are some houses in horror movies where I honestly wonder who was the architect behind this because it is way too creepy to be built by anybody. Like, did anyone look at it and say, in a certain light, I could see this house as being terrifying? No One Gets Out Alive is a 2021 horror movie about an undocumented woman who travels to Ohio and stays in a boarding house that contains a strange and mysterious entity. It's always interesting to see how different screenwriters have an effect on original material. This movie's based on Adam Neville's book of the same name, and Adam Neville is also the writer of a book that was turned into a Netflix movie, The Ritual, which is one of my favorite horror movies of the last decade. However, these writers, and possibly the director in particular, seem to focus on the oddest elements of the story and instead choose to highlight two very specific aspects and then push all their chips in the middle of the table on those two aspects. But then leave the central story of what is actually going on the sidelines until the very end, and then it just kind of gets quickly over it. The movie centers on Amber, who is an undocumented immigrant who came into Cleveland hoping to do something with her life after caring for her mother back in Mexico. She's able to get a job as a seamstress working for cash that her friend got her, and she stays at a cash-only hotel. However, she soon finds out that if she wants to stay any longer than a few days, she's going to need an ID, which she doesn't have. So in need of a longer-term place, she finds a local flyer about a women-only boarding house and decides to go there and rent a room. Now, this same house is the one that we see earlier in the cold open. Actually, technically, there's two cold opens in this movie. One is an archive footage of some sort of dig site in Mexico in 1963. And the other one is about another immigrant girl that gets attacked inside this house. That's something to do with a weird box. So clearly there's something afoot. Anyway, Amber goes to this boarding house. She meets Red, who inherited this building and is now fixing it up to be a boarding house. Both he and his brother, actually. So Amber takes the room and then sets her sights on the ID, which is what she needs because her uncle, who now lives in Cleveland, is setting her up with a real job interview, but she needs to have an ID for it. Now, I do feel like you need to have a little more than an ID in order to get a real job, but whatever, what do I know? So she trusts her friend who got her the job to acquire the fake ID, but that's going to require $3,000. All right, now, while this is all going on, there are some strange things happening at the old ranch. Like, she keeps seeing these visions and ghostly figures and constantly hears the sound of this girl crying. She also notices that the brother is in some kind of vegetative state. Like, he keeps kind of reciting something, he's banging his head against the wall. Very creepy vibes. She also comes across a private study and finds a bunch of random documents about this particular expedition or multiple expeditions in Mexico that we saw in the first cold open. Now, this is odd to Amber, of course, but she has bigger fish to fry, namely that $3,000. And so this is where we kind of get into that writer's thing that I mentioned at the top. It feels like the story here would shift into Amber, who's seeing like a bunch of ghosts, where she starts her own investigation as to what's causing it, mainly the strange artifacts in the study, thereby digging herself deeper and deeper and getting into more and more trouble. But that's not the story that they focus on. The two elements the writers focus on were more on the ghost-like scares that happened to Amber and the undocumented immigrant story of her trying to get a fake ID in order to secure a job from her uncle, which, by the way, she eventually gets scammed by her friend, causing even more issues. Now, getting back to the whole book adaptation thing, like, this movie feels like a snack machine where it's got tons of tantalizing options in there, but yet you can only access the top shelf, which has like mints or a few packs of gum. Clearly, there is a deep world here that is set up with some kind of mythology centered around the Tenochtitlan and some force around a box-like item. But that story sort of is brushed by for most of the movie in order to focus on the ghostly appearances that Amber gets haunted by even when she isn't in the house. And so this creates a situation where Amber becomes a fairly passive protagonist, to what ends up being the actual storyline in the end, which is this weird entity in a box in the basement. So as opposed to getting deeper on what's going on in the basement and with the brothers, we're treated to like all sorts of other things, like her money problems, the ghosts constantly popping up and showing themselves in the house, the guilt she feels about leaving her sick mother, and this would all be fine in terms of character development and to establish her mindset. But it gets so carried away with this, we didn't even realize that this movie isn't a ghost story movie, but this other thing, until over an hour into the 90-minute runtime. Like, Amber does wander through the study earlier than this, but none of that is really explained, and it doesn't seem like she is able to connect it with what she's experiencing, which is the ghosts in the house. So I don't know why it's there. Maybe it's just Easter eggs for the book, but it does nothing to actually advance the story or the plot. It's just things. I mean, she doesn't even really do much about the ghost thing either. She kind of just sees them along with the other residents of the building. I mean, eventually she finds everything about the basement, but it's more because it comes to her as opposed to something that she finds out on her own. All right, I'm going to get into a little bit of spoilers, so if you don't want to hear the spoilers, then I would say skip ahead. So I'm not going to get too deep into this because, to be honest, you really don't have to. Basically, Red and his brother are sacrificing women to this ancient power in the box. And we learn all of this because Red just kind of tells us everything after he captures and ties them all up an hour and 10 minutes into the movie. So really, she just stumbles on all of this. And nothing she's been dealing with gives her any insight as to what is now happening to her. And speaking of that, the way she ends up solving this problem and fighting the monster at the end felt super underdeveloped. Like, they hint at her relationship with her mother, but it's all very light and kind of sporadic so that they can focus more on the ghosts and goblins and spookiness of everything else. So when it comes to the big climax where she has to fight her way out, it was a bit of a surprise that the answer was dealing with her unresolved guilt about leaving her mother. The problem is we know so little about the monster and its motivations that it seems like that's coming out of left field. Like, seemingly a bunch of people were sacrificed to this demon, hence the ghosts wandering around the house. So do they all have that? Like, the demon won't kill you if you're able to be in therapy and work on yourself and have a healthy relationship with your mom? Now, there is a similar thing in The Ritual where its protagonist is haunted by unresolved guilt about his friend. But that was handled in a much better way, in a more singular way, and had built up to that throughout the story. With this, she just kind of keeps seeing her mother playing the same message over and over, but she also saw tons of spookies, so it was hard to recognize real versus perceived problems. I mean, she was dealing with so many problems about money and fake IDs and jobs that her guilt towards her mother felt like just kind of another piece, but with no real significance than what was happening. In the end, this movie felt like it was stuck in first gear for a lot of the runtime, and then it just kind of hard shifts into fifth 20 minutes before the end. Like, imagine if she had learned about the myth and all the rich culture and artifacts that she saw and how the creature feeds on one certain emotional trauma. Instead, it's just this guy doing a ritual that kills girls. End of story. Overall, this movie had a really solid start, and I loved the intro with the explorers in Mexico, and the ghosts are done really well and genuinely creepy at times. There was some solid performances throughout. I would say the visual style reminded me a little bit of Guillermo del Toro, where despite the lights being constantly in frame and on, that light never quite reaches most of the room, and so everything is really dark and gritty. I'll say it's probably a little too stylized for me at times, given the amount of blue light used in the room as ambient, but that's more of a personal nitpick. Now, the movie is listed as a creature feature, and it is eventually one, and I thought the design was very much in line with The Ritual as being extremely original. I just wish they didn't spend so much time on the ghost element, which turns out to be kind of a soft, passive element of the story. And it's a bit of a shame because there were so many deeper tapestries in this movie that ends up just being on the sidelines, in view but unused. But let me know what you think.